It's 2002, and you just got your first job a few months ago at your local grocery store because that's the only place that would hire you at your age. You saved up some of your money and decided to go to the mall to meet up with some friends. Of course, you got chicken teriyaki at the food court, the place where they hand out the free samples all the time, and then you finally walked into Abercrombie Fitch with enough money for that shirt that says some ridiculous non-age appropriate saying on it. It was your first Abercrombie shirt. Wearing Abercrombie would change everything. You would also make sure to hold on to that paper bag to cover your book with. Well, at least that's what sophomore in high school me thought at the time. This was during a time where it was almost better to fit in than be yourself. The era of the stereotypical cheerleaders and jocks being the popular kids, and all of them wore Abercrombie. At least in my high school they did. If I remember correctly, one of those popular girls in high school even worked at Abercrombie & Fitch. It was a huge deal. Nowadays, it wouldn't be because, well, the times have changed, and so has Abercrombie & Fitch. I've been wanting to dive into topics from my younger years that I view completely differently now that I'm an adult and a parent. I mean, toxic diet culture from the 90s to early 2000s is definitely on the list. How are we made to think that Nicole Richie was big by any means on Simple Life, or Jessica Simpson being fat shamed for how she looked in the picture that's currently on the screen? Anyway, I wanted to kick it off with a deep dive into Abercrombie & Fitch, the company that started off being an outfitter for elite outdoorsmen, but would eventually take a turn when it would hire Mike Jeffries as CEO, well, now former CEO. Someone who only hired good-looking people and as of recently was charged with sex trafficking. Let's get into the rise and fall of Abercrombie & Fitch and its possible comeback in this two-part series.
I like girls that wear Abercrombie & Fitch.
Did you know that Abercrombie & Fitch used to be for wealthy outdoorsmen? The wealthy part doesn't surprise me because when it was popular during my youth and, well, even now, while the prices aren't as high as other luxury brands, in my opinion, I wouldn't really consider them affordable, if that makes sense. However, I'm also very frugal and love finding great deals. With that said, I'm not surprised that they started off for the wealthy or the elite. They sold sporting and excursion goods, particularly expensive shotguns, fishing rods, fishing boats, and tents. Some people you may have heard of who were Abercrombie & Fitch customers were Theodore Roosevelt Safari and Admiral Richard E. Byrd's. His expedition to Antarctica was outfitted by Abercrombie & Fitch. Ernest Hemingway was a regular. And something sad that I found within my research was that the gun he used to unalive himself was actually purchased from Abercrombie & Fitch. Abercrombie & Fitch was founded in 1892 in none other than New York City, where their flagship store is located. It was founded by David T. Abercrombie and Ezra Fitch. It was Abercrombie Co. originally until Ezra, who was a wealthy lawyer, real estate developer, and a loyal Abercrombie customer, bought a stake in the business in 1900. Then in 1904, it was incorporated and renamed Abercrombie & Fitch Co. Ezra would eventually buy out David's portion of the business and became the sole owner from 1907 to 1928. Then, in the 1970s, is when Abercrombie & Fitch would start to struggle because of competitors with lower pricing. And Abercrombie didn't want to lose their elite status, so they weren't going to be like their competitors. By 1976, Abercrombie & Fitch filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and in 1977, they would have to close their flagship store in New York at Madison Avenue and East 45th Street. The interesting thing about this whole situation is that even though Abercrombie & Fitch closed its store and filed for bankruptcy, the name still meant something. That's why in 1978, Oshman's Sporting Goods, which was a Houston-based retail chain, bought the name Abercrombie & Fitch and their mailing list for $1.5 million, which according to the inflation calculator I used at the time of researching for this in 2024, that would be $7.5 million today. Well, Oshman's relaunched a company, but they would make it a mail order retailer, with some retail stores that opened up as well in Beverly Hills, Dallas, and New York City. In 1988, the company would be sold to The Limited, who was the parent company to a few chains, one of which was Victoria's Secret. Abercrombie & Fitch would start to shift their focus under The Limited. Now, they wanted to make young adults their target market. Eventually, it would become a publicly traded company. Following this, Mike Jeffries became CEO in the 1990s. Abercrombie & Fitch would morph into the Goliath that it was back then. In 1998, they would also launch a children's line, and in 2000 they would launch Hollister, which was basically Abercrombie but more of a laid-back California surfer style. Abercrombie & Fitch would also expand internationally. In 2005, they would expand into Canada, followed by expanding into Europe in 2007, Tokyo and other Asian countries in 2009, along with Mexico and the Middle East in 2015. As much as I'm not a huge fan of Abercrombie, I would say that's pretty impressive, especially for a store that isn't exactly on the really affordable side. It's not necessarily for just rich people, but again, as I said earlier in this video, I'm more of a frugal type of person and I like to find a good deal, and it just doesn't seem as affordable as other options out there, but I digress. Another interesting fact was that Abercrombie & Fitch opened up 2 college campus stores in 2018. This was so that they could reach their ideal college-age customer. As you can imagine, they didn't do well and, well, they closed. I'm sure the idea made sense, but something wasn't executed properly. Speaking of campuses, though, I was listening to a podcast called Everything Iconic with Danny Pellegrino, and Danny had the director of White Hot as a guest on the show to talk about the documentary. Now, if you haven't watched White Hot, it's a documentary on Netflix about the rise and fall of Abercrombie & Fitch, which I highly recommend watching. It's really good and goes way more in depth than I will in this video. Anyway, the director brought up a good point in that podcast. She had mentioned that with Abercrombie & Fitch corporate, they didn't have the normal corporate atmosphere. It was basically like the 13th grade, or also known as a super senior, and for my non-US listeners or viewers, our school system goes up to 12th grade, and after that you could either choose to go to a trade school, college, or whatever else you desire. You don't have to further your education after you get your high school diploma. However, required school is up to 12th grade. So with that said, working at Abercrombie in their corporate office was another year of high school. The people in the documentary spoke about how much they partied and how it was just part of the atmosphere. Now, if you think about that for a second, let's say some of these employees are straight out of college, and hypothetically speaking, they're the stereotypical frat boys that either you may know in person or have seen in the movies. Obviously, working for a company that was really popular and for the elite at one point, along with being able to party, that would be perfect for some people. From my own experience from going to college and graduate school, even I didn't want some serious, boring corporate job, but I ended up doing the whole corporate thing after working in retail for a long time. However, I can see why that would entice people to work for Abercrombie & Fitch, because not only was Abercrombie & Fitch for the cool kids, but now you could party with the cool kids that are even more elite because they're in corporate, not just in individual stores in the malls. Let's not forget the 1999 LFO song Summer Girls, where the lyrics said, "I like girls that wear Abercrombie & Fitch." That was basically free advertising for Abercrombie & Fitch. Now that you know a little bit about the background on Abercrombie & Fitch, let's talk about the controversial era, which would be the 2000s. The 2000s, a time where I was a teenager, but I can vividly remember Abercrombie & Fitch at their peak, and I can still smell Fierce, the cologne that was billowing out of that store. It's a scent that I don't think I will ever forget. The entire side of the mall that Abercrombie was on smelled like that cologne. Probably because the employees were told to spray the cologne constantly. Anyway, I succumbed to the popularity of Abercrombie because this was at a time where all I wanted to do was fit in. I learned to just be myself later on in life, but I wanted to be one of the cool kids even though I was far from what was considered cool at the time. Abercrombie was known for being the cool kids. Mike Jeffries, the CEO at the time, even said the brand was for the cool and popular kids. Quote, "We're looking for the attractive young American with a great attitude and lots of friends. A lot of people aren't made for our clothes. They can't have them. Are we excluding them? Absolutely." End quote. In my experience in school, there was the stereotypical cliques in my grade where you had the popular football players and cheerleaders, and you had the smart kids who were considered the nerds, the goth kids that were some of the nicest freaking people. Shout out to the goth kids I went to school with. And of course, all of the other stereotypes you've seen in all of the movies. However, I say all of that because that was the norm at the time. For Abercrombie to be targeted towards the cool kids, it didn't seem problematic at the time, since that's just how it was. And in addition to that, you had other stores such as Hot Topic that were targeted towards a certain group as well, or PacSun and things of that nature. But there were two people that I went to school with who did in fact get recruited to work at Abercrombie & Fitch. So in my head, I thought, wow, they are special and works of art. Abercrombie was known for the dimly lit store, the loudest music possible in a store. It was as if you were in a nightclub, half naked to almost naked models on the walls, and something that you wouldn't be able to replicate today. Not just because of it being inappropriate or vulgar in some people's eyes, but as much as some people hated it or refused to shop there, I'm willing to bet that about 95% of us all remember it if you lived in that time in America with Abercrombie and all of that kind of stuff. But besides Hot Topic and maybe Hollister, which is Abercrombie's younger sibling, but more California than Americana, I don't think there are too many stores that left a huge impact when it comes to the nostalgia side of my brain. Abercrombie created its own aesthetic, and you would recognize it anywhere. If you see any of the nostalgia creators that pop up, they have made videos about this as well. Hollister was even louder and darker than Abercrombie too, which makes me laugh looking back on it now. Going back to the aesthetics of Abercrombie though, I wonder if making it as obnoxious as possible wasn't just for reasons of being elite or the cool kids, but also because when I was younger, I almost never saw parents in there. As a parent now, I can't do loud music like I used to be able to, so I wonder if it could have been something where the kids knew that their parents hated going in there, so now it was even more cool because, well, my parents don't like it in here, so that must mean it's cool because anything my parents like or do is uncool or cringy. Does that thought process make sense at all? I hope that I'm making sense. Anyway, besides Abercrombie being for the cool kids, what else could possibly be wrong that caused the downfall of Abercrombie? Well, a lot. Let's start off with some controversial shirts that I think really started the downfall, kind of like a snowball effect. Besides the fact that Abercrombie could literally sell a garbage bag as a t-shirt for their $25 price in the early 2000s, they started adding some graphics to these shirts that were either just inappropriate or vulgar to downright racist. Quote, "Sometimes that kind of publicity can help a retailer more than it hurts," said retail analyst Jennifer Black with Wells Fargo Securities in Portland, Oregon. In all honesty, I think the controversy over sexually charged advertising is kind of a marketing thing. The teens love it. And they're crucial to Abercrombie's customer base, Black said. But pushing controversial racial or ethnic depictions is different, said Black, who added that the best damage control might be to come out with an immediate apology, end quote. While Abercrombie did have run-ins with activist groups along with state governments because of what was sexually suggestive advertising, campaigns, and catalog photos, it didn't stop them. One of the shirts that sparked a lot of controversy had the phrase, quote, "Wong Brothers Laundry Service, 2 Wongs can make it white," end quote, with 2 men caricatures that were a racist representation of Asians. Quote, "But digging online, you can find a whole list of douchey t-shirts that Abercrombie stopped producing, from The Island of Lesbos, Every Man's Dream, to Extreme Makeover, in which the drawing of a paper bag left no room for misunderstanding," as Cam Wolf wrote in GQ. The feeling was that customers expected to see the brand behave in the rough and rude manner of the high schoolers it aspired to dress. Abercrombie was an aspirational brand, and such, it did not sell only clothes, which not by chance are marginal in the story told by White Hot, but a world, the all-American world of muscular young men portrayed in the photos of Bruce Weber, and imagery created so accurately and maniacally by former CEO Mike Jeffries that it has become a standard to follow. end quote. As you can tell just by the way that quote was written, that back then the racist shirts weren't really looked at the way that they are today. With that said, let's get back to the racist shirts towards Asians because there were more. After the Two Wongs Can Make It White shirt came out, there was obviously outrage, but Hampton Carney, who was with Paul Wilmot Communications in New York, a public relations firm, stated, quote, "We personally thought Asians would love this t-shirt," end quote. I'm failing to see how Asians would love this type of t-shirt. They can't say it's because Asians are being represented at Abercrombie because it's making fun of Asians in so many different ways by the fonts, the characters, and the saying on the shirt. Not to mention, as we'll go over later, they weren't too keen on hiring, or if they did hire, they would keep them in the back, but they weren't too keen on hiring people of color or really anyone that wasn't a thin white girl or white football player looking kind of guy. There was another shirt that said, quote, "Walk and bowl, let the good times roll, Chinese food and bowling," end quote. That had the stereotypical character on it, similar to the Wong brothers shirt. Another shirt stated, quote, "Abercrombie and Fitch, Buddha bash, get your Buddha on the floor," end quote. I remember when I was watching White Hot and they had gotten onto this topic in the documentary, one of the interviewees actually said that they were just making whatever shirts they could and putting them out there because people were buying them anyway. They did mention that they had made other controversial shirts that were not aimed at Asians but other minorities. For some reason, the Asian shirts sparked the most outrage and the other shirts just kind of got swept under the rug. In my opinion, I think the shirts would have just kept getting worse if no one had said anything. According to one source from 2002, after this happened, quote, "The shirts were designed to appeal to young Asian shoppers with a sense of humor," Carney told the Chronicle yesterday. "The shirts were available for sale yesterday in the Abercrombie store at San Francisco Shopping Center on Market Street. Whether they will remain on the shelves was unclear yesterday," the spokesman said. "We are truly and deeply sorry we've offended people," said Carney, adding that he had spent much of the afternoon returning calls of complaint, many of them from Stanford students. "We never single out any group to poke fun at," Carney said. "We poke fun at everyone, from women to flight attendants to baggage handlers to football coaches to Irish Americans to snow skiers. There's really no group we haven't teased," end quote. Which is kind of a bullshit apology, or actually lack thereof. Yeah, so we're sorry for offending you, but we make fun of everybody, so it's okay. That apology is the epitome of who they targeted Abercrombie and Fitch to. The stereotypical popular kids who made fun of anyone who wasn't popular or who didn't look like them. So I guess maybe that apology really isn't all that shocking. Students at MIT in Massachusetts would eventually protest outside of Abercrombie stores. Quote, "I think they need to apologize, to make a public statement, but I also think they need to start looking at their whole strategy for how they portray people," Troy said. "Maybe it sells in the suburbs, but their whole national marketing image is buff, tan, male and female models without any Asian representation," end quote. The shirts were eventually pulled, but I just don't know how they even made it in there to begin with. It's fine to have edgy t-shirts that can be controversial, but not when they're just downright racist. Abercrombie was always known for their sexually suggestive t-shirts, which is wild to think about now as an adult because their demographic was underage teens, and of course college kids were already above the legal age, but underage teens were also buying these shirts, but they still sold them. No matter what outrage there was, they sold a lot of clothes. Now that we are talking about these sexually suggestive shirts and how underage kids were part of the demographic, let's go over Bruce Weber since he was in charge of all of the ads and catalogs since they were such a big part of the brand. It's mind-blowing that a clothing brand was successful by creating ads with the least amount of clothing as possible. Bruce Weber was a photographer behind these photos. Bruce Weber made quite the name for himself when it came to photographing for well-known brands such as Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren, Karl Lagerfeld, Versace, and Abercrombie & Fitch. He's a photographer and filmmaker, but he was most known for his fashion photography that was mostly in black and white. He started to become well known when he created what one source called minimal but racy Calvin Klein campaigns. This would be the start of his career and fame in the late 80s and early 90s. Of course, Abercrombie would eventually come into Bruce's life as well when Mike Jeffries took over. Working as a photographer for Abercrombie was probably great for Bruce, especially with just how popular Abercrombie was at the time. It wouldn't be long before allegations would start, and those would first become public in December of 2017. The allegations were that he allegedly groped some men during photo shoots, along with assisting them with breathing exercises. It happened so often, allegedly, because the models would say that another model was being Bruceified if they were with Bruce while he was doing these alleged breathing exercises or other inappropriate behavior. Jason Boyce, who is a former model, sued Bruce. This was due to inappropriate behavior that included unwanted touching and kissing. Not too long after Jason came out and sued Bruce, another model came forward and stated that Bruce preyed on him in 2005. The only difference is that this second male model would not press any charges against Bruce. A month after that, 15 current and former male models would end up accusing Bruce of sexual harassment, unnecessary nudity, and coercive sexual behavior during professional photo shoots. Anthony Baldwin was one of those models, and he claimed that while he was on a shoot for Abercrombie in 2009 on Amelia Island in Florida, Bruce became annoyed when Anthony wouldn't pose nude. Anthony claims that after he refused to pose nude, Bruce groped him while he was in his underwear after doing his breathing exercises. Bruce would deny the claims. Quote, "In December 2018, 5 male models filed a lawsuit against Weber, alleging the photographer had exploited or sexually assaulted them. Per the New York Times, the legal complaint calls Weber a serial sexual predator, and lawyers representing the models describe the photographer's actions as sex trafficking. It's considered a commercial sex act because the person who applied is hoping to get a job," attorney Lisa Bloom, whose firm represented the 5 models, told the New York Times. Weber again denied the allegations. "I have used common breathing exercises and professionally photographed thousands of nude models over my career, but never touched anyone inappropriately," he told the New York Times in a statement. Jane Weintraub, one of Weber's attorneys, added, "We are confident that Mr. Weber will prevail against these false allegations, not just with words, but with evidence in a court of law." End quote. Of course, due to all of these accusations and the bad press surrounding Bruce, it would affect him financially. In January 2018, Condé Nast, which at the time published Vogue, Vanity Fair, GQ, and other magazines, stated that they would no longer hire Bruce for the foreseeable future, and of course, other brands, one of which being Abercrombie Fitch, would cut ties. The lawsuit did have some issues though, one of which was in June of 2020. Lisa Bloom, the lawyer representing the models, was ordered to pay Bruce over $28,000 in legal costs. This was due to Jason Boyce refusing to answer certain questions at a deposition. Quote, "Upon insistence from Bloom and her team, the deposition was shut down. She then chose to reschedule and now has to pay the fees." End quote. He would work again eventually, but multiple reports were released in September 2021 that stated Bruce settled both Jason Boyce's lawsuit along with the joint suit between Josh Ardoff, Anthony Baldwin, Jacob Madden, and I'm going to put this next name on the screen because I will probably butcher the pronunciation, but Yanana Van Oyen. The joint suit was settled with no admission of guilt, but beyond that, no details were disclosed. Jason's suit also did not have details disclosed. In September 2020, a judge dismissed Buddy Kruger's suit against Bruce. This was what one source claimed to be because Buddy's recollection of the alleged incidents were a bit murky. Quote, "Bloom told us at the time, like many sexual assault accusers, Kruger had to contend with a touch statute of limitations, which unfairly limits the time sexual assault accusers can file lawsuits. No matter how strong their case, the dismissal of his case was based on that timeline only and had nothing to do with the truth of Mr. Kruger's allegations, end quote. Basically what happened was it seemed like Buddy was trying to fit what happened into the statute of limitations because he couldn't get the dates right. If that's indeed what was happening, I can definitely see why Buddy would try to add in his experience. Everyone involved in all of the lawsuits against Bruce eventually just decided to put this behind them and went on with their lives. When it comes to this type of situation, I'm sure if there is a promise of getting better modeling gigs on the other side, some models would have gone along with it. I'm not saying that's what happened here because I'm seriously not trying to get sued here, but it's just a thought I had while reading about all of these cases. Bruce went on with his life too, although things would never really go back to what it once was. On April 3rd, 2024, The Hollywood Reporter went on to publish an interview on Alan Richson, and Alan had made comments about the prior allegations against Bruce Weber and Mario Testino, quote, "Some of the stories were just like mine. I was just starting to build a platform and get my voice in the business, and I wondered, should I say something? Because all of the stories that those models were telling were my own. It's all true," end quote. There is also another part of the article where Alan talks about the modeling industry, and while he wasn't making a broad statement and not really accusing anyone in particular, meaning Bruce, since this is Bruce's chapter of the deep dive, I wanted to share it anyway just to provide some insight on the industry as a whole. This way, if anyone watching this has the thoughts of, it couldn't be that bad, or they signed up for it, maybe this part of the article will make you think twice. Quote, "There are very few redeeming qualities to working in that industry. Let's be honest, it's like legalized sex trafficking. The industry is not regulated, and it's a widely known secret that if you're hired on a job, you're basically being passed off to a photographer to be trafficked. The number of times and situations where I was put in horrific environments where sexual abuse was the goal and the paycheck that you were desperate for in order to survive was the carrot. I can't count on two hands. It was quite often. It was an impossible situation for models that could be even worse for women," he acknowledges. "You're always dancing around this very terrible line of, how do I keep the job and not completely offend this photographer or this agent or whoever set this thing up, and how do I not get raped? I completely empathize with women who deal with dynamic power struggles with predatory people in the workplace. It's still unfair, but if I really had to, I could get myself out of whatever room I was in through a physical altercation. Most women don't have that option. Imagine how terrifying it must be," end quote. With all of that said about Bruce's alleged dark past with these Abercrombie and Fitch models, let's talk about the legal issues and lawsuits that the company as a whole went through. Oh, and I'll be getting into all of the allegations against Mike Jeffries later on in this series. There are a number of things that I'm going to go over in this section, and if I for some reason miss any lawsuits or anyone watching this knows of any more, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Anyway, let's start off with some of the employment practices within Abercrombie & Fitch and the lawsuits that they had to face with that. The first lawsuit was one from 2004, Gonzalez versus Abercrombie & Fitch. The company was accused of discriminating against African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and women when it came to who worked on the floor as a model, as opposed to who worked in the back, along with giving store management positions to Caucasian men. Within this lawsuit, it was stated that Abercrombie & Fitch violated Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 due to what I just stated before. According to one source, when talking about basically hiding some employees in the back because they didn't look the part when it came to Abercrombie & Fitch, they stated, quote, "They were steered not to sales positions out front, but to low visibility back of the store job stocking and cleaning up," end quote. This case did make it onto the TV show 60 Minutes at one point too. Now here's the thing. Companies obviously hire employees for specific positions, and when I worked in retail, there were people who were hired just for the stockroom or the cleaning crew that came at nighttime. They didn't only hire specific people and minorities for these roles. We actually had a very diverse team in most of the places I worked at. Abercrombie was basically hiding the people they didn't deem worthy enough to be the face of Abercrombie and Fitch in the stockroom. Well, in April of 2005, according to one source, the U.S. District Court approved a settlement which was approximately $50 million. Abercrombie & Fitch was to provide monetary benefits to the class of Latino, African American, Asian American, and female applicants and employees who charged Abercrombie & Fitch with discrimination. In addition to this settlement, there was also a consent decree. If you don't know what it is, it's an agreement or settlement that resolves a dispute between two parties without admission of guilt in a criminal case or liability in a civil case. The plaintiff and defendant will ask the court to enter into an agreement, and the court will basically supervise any implementations that were ordered to happen within the settlement. The company was required to implement new policies and programs that promoted more diversity within the workplace. This was to prevent discrimination in the future. The consent decree was put into place in 2011. Abercrombie did not admit liability. According to one source, quote, in 2008 to 2010, during the 6-year monitoring phase of the consent decree, a dispute arose regarding whether Abercrombie's in-store marketing material, predominantly comprising larger-than-life posters of mostly white models, deterred non-white applicants and/or encouraged managers to give preference to white applicants in hiring and promoting employees, and whether this violated the consent decree. Specifically, the decree required that Abercrombie will reflect diversity as reflected by the major racial or ethnic priority populations of the United States in its marketing materials taken as a whole. Consent Decree Section XC1, page 19, plaintiffs and the EEOC brought a motion before the special master and then the court seeking to require Abercrombie to diversify its marketing, arguing that the marketing serves as a hiring guide. The special master and court denied the motion. End quote. Moving on to the next lawsuit. This next lawsuit takes place overseas in June of 2009. Riam Dean, who was a British law student, and Riam had worked for Abercrombie & Fitch at their flagship store in London, Savile Row. There is something called an employment tribunal, and I did not know what this was, but if you are like me, here is the explanation according to Wikipedia. Employment tribunals are tribunal public bodies in both England and Wales and Scotland that have statutory jurisdiction to hear disputes between employers and employees. The most common disputes are concerned with unfair dismissal, redundancy payments, and employment discrimination. The tribunals are part of the UK tribunals system administered by HM Courts and Tribunal Services, an executive agency of the Ministry of Justice. End quote. Well, Riam took Abercrombie to an employment tribunal. Riam was born without a left forearm and had been wearing a prosthetic limb since she was about 3 months old, according to one source. At first, when she was hired, she was able to work up front, but was told she was given special permission to wear clothing that covered her prosthetic limb. Think about that for a second. It's messed up that she couldn't just be herself and not have to ask for permission to cover or not cover her prosthetic limb. Anyway, eventually she would be told that she didn't pass the look policy that Abercrombie & Fitch had, and she was sent to work in the stockroom away from any customers. In case you didn't know what the look policy is or was, it was exactly what you think it is. If you didn't look the way Abercrombie wanted for their store, which judging by the Abercrombie that was at my mall was basically white guys and girls who looked like models and the popular kids at school. According to one source, they explained the look policy a little more eloquently than I did, and they stated, quote, "The look policy stipulates that all employees represent Abercrombie & Fitch with natural, classic, American style, consistent with the company's brand, and look great while exhibiting individuality. Workers must wear a clean, natural, classic hairstyle and have nails which extend no more than a 1/4 inch beyond the tip of the finger." End quote. Riam at one point did talk about all of this and said things such as she was bullied out of her job and that it was the lowest point in her life. There was more that she stated as well. Quote, A female Abercrombie & Fitch manager used the look policy and the wearing of the cardigan as an excuse to hide me away in the stockroom. I knew then that I was being treated different and unfairly because of my disability. Her words pierced right through the armor of 20 years of building up personal confidence about me as a person, and that I am much more than a girl with only one arm, end quote. Dean said the look policy was inconsistent. Quote, having visible tattoos breaks the look policy, and yet I've seen a worker with a tribal arm tattoo, which is very noticeable, and yet Abercrombie allowed him to work on the shop floor. Clearly, their reasoning goes far deeper, and I'm sure it's not the cardigan which breaks the look policy. It's the disabled label which does. She added, I am born with a character trait I am unable to change. Thus, to be singled out for a minor aesthetic flaw made me question my worth as a human being. Abercrombie taught me that beauty lies in perfection, but I would tell them that beauty lies in diversity, for I would rather live with my imperfection than to exude such ugliness in their blatant display of eugenics and policies and practices. End quote. Several months before she started working at Abercrombie, she did go through a psychiatric assessment in order to apply for disability support. The psychiatrist stated that she was socially isolated with an anxiety disorder that was so bad it reached phobic levels when it came to a fear of traveling on public transport. The Abercrombie & Fitch barrister, Akash Naubat, stated that someone who had the phobia that Rhiam had would have a hard time working at Abercrombie just with the noise level itself, and suggested that she may have exaggerated her medical problems. However, being socially isolated is something that happens to a lot of people, and some people try to work through it and do try to live a normal life. Not to mention, the phobia that was described in this one source relates to traveling on public transport, not working in a loud store. So I think that suggestion is a bit out of line and very victim blamey, but maybe there was more information and there's more context to be given here. But I will say that again, given that this is Abercrombie, it's not all that shocking if they're just being a-holes, if I'm being completely honest here. Akash also accused Rhiam of exaggerating the effect that Abercrombie had on her while she was working there, and that she had lied on the claim form she submitted to the tribunal. Rhiam did end up stating that there was one part of her original claim form that was false, only one. She stated that the part where she had been repeatedly asked by management to remove her prosthetic arm was implied to be a mistake. I'm not sure of the exact conversation here, so it could have been an over-exaggeration on her part or even a misunderstanding. Regardless of what it was, I think we can all agree, given Abercrombie & Fitch's history, I don't think her being put in the stockroom because of her disability is a reach. Rhiam sued for disability discrimination and was looking for £20,000 in damages. Well, in August 2009, the tribunal ruled that Rhiam Dean was wrongfully dismissed and unlawfully harassed. She didn't get the £20,000 she was looking for, but she was awarded £8,013 for loss of earnings and wrongful dismissal. Since this is a two-part series and the legal portions of this video or this series is the longest out of all of the other sections, I'm going to save the rest for part 2 of this series. In part 2, I will also go over the sex trafficking charges against Mike Jeffries and 2 other people. Thank you so much for watching part 1, and make sure to subscribe and like this video. This is Monica reporting to you live from a highway, and I will see you in part 2. Bye! Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my Abercrombie & Fitch deep dive series. Make sure to check out part 1 to learn more about the history of Abercrombie and the first half of the legal issues that they've been involved in. But without further ado, let's get into part 2. This lawsuit was filed in September of 2009 by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission versus Abercrombie & Fitch stores. There was a 17-year-old by the name of Samantha Alauf who applied to the Abercrombie Kids store in Woodland Hills Mall in Tulsa, Oklahoma in June of 2008. Due to religious beliefs, she wore, and still wears, a hijab. As you can probably figure out, she obviously wore a hijab during her interview, but at the time did not say why. Heather Cook, who was interviewing Samantha, was impressed with her, but the hijab was a bit of a concern due to the look policy. Because Heather liked Samantha during the interview process, she had spoken with the manager of the store that she believed the hijab was being worn for religious purposes. The manager stated that employees were not allowed to wear hats at work and that they would not hire her. Due to this, in 2009, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would go on to sue Abercrombie & Fitch on Samantha's behalf. The lawsuit would make its way to the federal court district, and Samantha would receive $20,000 in damages. However, this was later reversed by the 10th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. They served in Abercrombie's favor because Samantha, quote, did not provide the company with the information about her need for an accommodation, end quote, which is a seriously laughable technicality, but I digress. On June 1st, 2015, the Supreme Court would rule in Samantha's favor 8-1. Associate Justice Antoine Scalia stated that Samantha did not have to request any type of accommodation for wearing a headscarf with a no-hat policy. Thank you, finally. Justice Samuel Alito stated that because there was evidence of Abercrombie's knowledge of Samantha's religious practice, this was sufficient enough to rule against Abercrombie. Justice Clarence Thomas agreed, quote, with the majority's interpretation that Title VII protects against intentional discrimination against a particular religious group, but felt that Abercrombie did not really engage in that here because their dress code was a religion-neutral policy that affected all potential applicants. This ruling revived the lawsuit Samantha Alauf had filed against the company, end quote. Knowing Abercrombie & Fitch's history and their problematic ways, I would find it hard to believe if discrimination didn't happen when it came to not hiring Samantha Alauf. I obviously don't know because I'm not an Abercrombie & Fitch lawyer or anybody that worked on the case, but this is just my opinion. There are even more cases when it comes to lawsuits, and this next one is about Hani Khan, who was demanded to remove her hijab because it violates the look policy. This happened back in 2010, but the lawsuit was filed in 2011. 19-year-old Hani was working primarily in the stockroom at a Hollister store, which is Abercrombie & Fitch's sister store at the Hillsdale Shopping Center in San Mateo, California. When she started working, they hadn't given her any issue about her headscarves, besides asking if she could wear them in the Hollister colors, which she agreed to. In mid-February of 2010, she was told that her hijab went against Abercrombie's look policy, and in addition, that she would not be on schedule if she didn't take off her hijab at work. Obviously, she didn't agree because her religion meant more to her than a job, and she was fired on February 23rd for this. Quote, in an order issued September 3rd, U.S. District Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers noted, it is undisputed that Khan was terminated for noncompliance with the company's look policy. Khan's only violation of the look policy was the headscarf. The court dismissed Abercrombie's argument that its look policy goes to the very heart of the business model, and thus any requested accommodation to deviate from the look policy threatens the company's success, observing that Abercrombie only offers unsubstantiated opinion testimony of its own employees to support its claim of undue hardship. The deposition testimony and declarations from Abercrombie witnesses demonstrate their personal beliefs but are not linked to any credible evidence, end quote. The court made it clear that firing Hani for wearing her hijab was illegal. Eventually, there would be a settlement. Quote, clothing retailer Abercrombie & Fitch has agreed to pay $71,000 and to change its policies to settle two separate religious discrimination lawsuits on behalf of Muslim teens wearing hijabs, religious headscarves, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission announced today. This settlement follows last week's ruling finding Abercrombie liable for religious discrimination in one case, and an April 2013 ruling dismissing its undue hardship claims in the other suit, end quote. In 2009, Abercrombie was fined more than $115,000 by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. This was due to them not allowing a teenager to have her sister help her in the fitting room because she has autism and needs help to try clothes on. I'll leave a link to the legal documents that provide a full breakdown of what happened, but I'll share some of the main points on the documents. In the documents, they refer to the teenager as MM, but use her sister and mother's names. On August 23, 2005, 14-year-old MM had gone back to school shopping with her mom and sister, and her sister was helping her shop. MM is autistic, and as described in the documents, she does need help while out or even at home. She wasn't allowed to stay at home alone at the time. MM, as a 14-year-old, had known that she was different, but the extent of it is something she didn't quite understand. With them back to school shopping, as you can imagine, it was busy. MM and her sister Brittany Maxson went to Abercrombie while their mom was finishing up at one of the other department stores. Quote, "The sisters selected some clothing to try on and waited in a long line for a fitting room. When they got to the head of the line, a sales associate counted their items and placed their items in a fitting room. When MM attempted to enter the fitting room with her sister, the sales associate told the girls that only one person could enter the fitting room at a time. Brittany Maxson explained to the sales associate that her sister had a disability and they needed to stay together. The sales associate said he was sorry, but the store policy was aimed at preventing theft and only one person could use a fitting room at a time. Brittany Maxson then told him that MM had autism and could not be left alone. He again said he was sorry and he asked them to step aside so that others could use the fitting room. The girls complied with his request. When Brittany Maxson inquired why she could bring several shopping bags from other stores into the fitting room but not her disabled sister, the sales associate politely repeated that the store policy was one person per fitting room. MM became agitated and began bouncing on the balls of her feet and talking to herself. She asked her sister several times why they were not allowed to use the fitting room when it was their turn, end quote. Due to this, Brittany called their mom Elizabeth, but by that point, MM was upset, saying how it was her turn to go to the fitting room. Elizabeth tried to explain that Brittany was a caregiver for MM due to her disability. The Abercrombie employee would not budge and kept saying it was store policy. Elizabeth did obtain the customer service number and called until the manager came back, but was met with attitude on the other line, and the customer service rep was of no help and said something along the lines of, "So you think our policy is ridiculous?" When Elizabeth asked a manager, they said the same thing, but when Elizabeth had asked to see the actual policy they're referring to, they couldn't show her. After speaking with the manager, he offered to let them buy whatever they like and try it on at home and return whatever they didn't like. What? I'm sorry, but how condescending is that? Especially when your only issue here is allowing someone to have assistance in a fitting room due to a disability. I worked in retail for over a decade, and maybe it was the places that I had worked were more ethical in that aspect, well, in my opinion, but I can't imagine not allowing someone to help their disabled sister in a fitting room, even if it was against policy, just from a moral standpoint. Maybe it's just me, but once you've worked in retail for so long, you learn how to pick and choose your battles with customers. And I mean, it does help when you're a manager, but while I didn't budge on letting a woman return used and disgusting shoes claiming they were brand new and then proceeding to throw them at me because I wouldn't return them, I would budge on a fitting room policy knowing the situation. Anyway, according to the legal proceedings, there was a part in the document that stated they eventually found the handbook and the fitting room policy, which stated, quote, "In most cases, only one person is allowed to be in the fitting room at a time. Some exceptions to this rule include parents with their kids and a disabled person's assistant. In most other cases, do your best to manage fitting room capacity before customers enter the fitting room. Once a customer enters a fitting room, they have a right to privacy," end quote. There was also another part of the handbook pertaining to people with disabilities, and it stated, quote, "Abercrombie & Fitch is committed to customer service, which includes assisting disabled customers when they visit our stores, try on, and purchase our merchandise. Abercrombie & Fitch expects you to uphold that level of customer service, first and foremost because every customer is important to us, Also, the Americans with Disability Act requires that we do our best to remove physical obstacles in the stores that could prevent use by persons with disabilities. The associates in human resources, your manager and district manager, are always available to assist you in making sure that we can satisfy our customers, end quote. So clearly what happened to MM was wrong and went against policy. Not the whole one person to a fitting room thing, but the whole assisting disabled people part. I'm glad they were able to go after Abercrombie for this, because while it may seem like a mishap to some people, it was a lot for MM. She did go see a doctor and they stated that the situation left her scared and upset, and she kept saying it was her fault this happened. And within the legal documents, they did say that MM should have received money for mental anguish. It's a very sad situation overall, and knowing how Abercrombie was back then, I'm not surprised at just how many awful situations have happened. There was another case of a 16-year-old teenage girl who caught a 21-year-old man videotaping her in Nashville in September 2007. I haven't been able to find too many articles speaking about this case, but what I was able to find was the 21-year-old's name is Kenneth Applegate II. He denied videotaping the 16-year-old changing in the fitting room, but apparently this was his MO and he had done it numerous times. This 16-year-old was the first one to catch him and the only one that was on the memory of the camera he used. This phone was actually found by a coworker under some stacks of clothing. A lawsuit would be filed in Davidson County Circuit Court in 2009. Within that lawsuit, the at the time 16-year-old victim stated that she noticed that while she was trying on clothes, she saw some movement in the dressing room and she screamed, then quickly opened the door, which must have scared Kenneth because he ran off. Criminal court records show that Kenneth was arrested for a few days after they found the camera. Kenneth would enter a guilty plea to the unlawful photographing of a minor. He would be convicted and sentenced to 11 months and 29 days incarceration, which was reduced to 45 days on the condition that he would attend counseling or sexual deviant behavior. One article referred to the 16-year-old as a woman, so I'm assuming that at the time of the lawsuit, she had probably turned 18, but I don't know for sure, so I'll use girl and woman kind of interchangeably in this section, but just know that she was a 16-year-old underage teen at the time of this happening. That is very important, and I have to reiterate it. Anyway, she was suing Abercrombie for gross negligence since they hired Kenneth even though he had exhibited weird behavior previously. She also claimed that Abercrombie knowingly allowed him to have a camera at work. The lawsuit accuses Abercrombie and Kenneth of invasion of privacy and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Quote, Abercrombie engages in a policy, practice, and procedure of hiring very young employees to work in its stores. Young Abercrombie employees are promoted frequently to management positions when they lack the maturity, experience, training, skills, and or abilities necessary to discharge their duties in a reasonably prudent fashion, end quote. The lawsuit did talk about how Abercrombie's advertising and branding is pretty provocative and the environment is sexually charged, so this type of environment and culture could attract individuals who enjoy this or who display deviant behavior like Kenneth. One article stated that the lawsuit seeks $1.5 million in compensation and punitive damages for the traumatization, mental anguish, shock, fright, horror, fear, anxiety, worry, and other harms allegedly done to this woman. I haven't been able to find if anything was awarded to this victim, so if anyone watching this knows about this, please leave it in the comment section below, and if you have a source, please leave your source as well. Which, side note, all of my sources for this deep dive will be listed in the description box below. Anyway, Abercrombie was also inducted into the Sweatshop Hall of Fame 2010. This is what the Sweatshop Hall of Fame document stated, quote, Abercrombie & Fitch, illegal suspensions. Delayed bargaining. Abercrombie & Fitch clothing is manufactured at Alta Mode factory in the Philippines. Employees of the factory sought to form a union to address concerns, and on the day of the Alta Mode Workers Union was to be certified, all of the more than 100 union members and officers were placed on forced leave, a clear case of employer interference in the exercise of the right to unionize and an unfair labor practice by law. Workers have struggled for a union as an antidote to a production quota sent beyond human capacity. It is essential for Abercrombie to send a strong signal to the factory that freedom of association violations will not be tolerated. The Abercrombie supplier has even filed criminal cases against the union members. This factory case is a clear example of the flagrant disregard for the law by garment factory owners in the Philippines. Unfortunately, Abercrombie doesn't even have a public code of conduct and utilizes factory inspectors that have missed glaring issues such as the ones highlighted in the Alta Mode factory. One for major concern is that Abercrombie shifts its production around from factory to factory, which results in lack of stable orders at the factory. ILRF encourages Abercrombie to build long-term meaningful relationships with the suppliers so that their standards around wages, overtime, and freedom of association are clearly enforced. Act now. Next time you shop at Abercrombie & Fitch, take the time to ask about labor standards at the factories that produce Abercrombie and Hollister clothing. Encourage the company to be more transparent about its expectations." End quote. There was a class action filed in 2010 relating to a 2009 holiday gift card promotion. Now, all of the following information is coming straight from topclassactions.com. Hollister and Abercrombie had issued $25 promotional gift cards for any customer who made a purchase of $75 or more with no expiration date. However, the claims that customers made was the gift cards were voided on January 30th, 2010. The plaintiff, Vincent Daniels, did file a class action lawsuit against Hollister and Abercrombie, stating that they allegedly didn't honor the terms of the gift cards. The settlement stated that within 5 business days after the settlement's effective date, 70% of the original remaining value on the gift cards would be restored, and you would be able to use them. I mean, I guess $17.50 is better than nothing. In this case, I think it would be more about the principle as opposed to the actual monetary value. Then there is the case of Jilly Hicks, where the gift cards could be used at Hollister stores for 6 months after the settlement's effective date. The settlement also stated that plaintiffs may apply for payments of up to $5,000 for each person subject to court approval. The defendants agreed to pay settlement costs in an amount not to exceed $20,000 and $450,000 to plaintiffs' counsel. Of course, as with so many things that have to do with Abercrombie, both Abercrombie and Hollister denied the allegations, but they did settle the case in 2016. I know for big companies like Abercrombie and Hollister, it's actually easier to just settle cases than go to court, but also, did the people at the top not have any integrity? Did they not care that they had to settle so many cases instead of either going to court to fight it because they're in the right, or, I don't know, stop doing the things that cause people to fight for justice? In addition to people taking legal action against Abercrombie, Abercrombie did file a lawsuit against American Eagle Outfitters. Around the time where Abercrombie was at their peak in the early 2000s, while they were similar from what I can remember, whether it be the advertising or just people from my area growing up, but Abercrombie was meant for the stereotypical popular kids, as I've said numerous times, whereas American Eagle was more for the laid-back, 2000s hippie, preppy, hybrid type. I don't know if that makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense. At least that's how I viewed it. I say that because the lawsuit had to do with Abercrombie claiming American Eagle had copied their designs and had mimicked their advertising and marketing. The lawsuit was based on a trade dress claim. If you don't know what that means, according to Wikipedia, it is the characteristics of visual appearance of a product or its packaging or even the design of a building that signify the source of the product to consumers. Trade dress is an aspect of trademark law, which is a form of intellectual property protection law. The specific part of the marketing that Abercrombie & Fitch was referencing was things like certain pieces of clothing, the visual merchandising or indoor displays, and the product catalog. I mean, how many different ways are you supposed to advertise basic jeans and basic t-shirts with controversial graphics or just regular graphic tees? As an adult now, I look back and think how basic and similar all of it was, but at the time you could tell if someone shopped at Abercrombie & Fitch. They just had a specific look. Quote, for its clothing design, Abercrombie claimed trade dress protection for the use of words such as performance, authentic, and genuine. And for design elements such as primary color combinations, in connection with solid, plain, and striped designs. For its store setup, it claimed trade dress protection for in-store design elements and the use of college students as sales associates. For its catalog, it claimed protection for its style of photography, editorial content, and the particular display of its clothes, end quote. However, quote, despite the admission that American Eagle might have utilized very similar materials, designs, in-store displays, symbols, color combinations, and patterns as Abercrombie, the court ruled that there was not an excessive level of similarity to confuse potential customers, and therefore the court ruled in favor of American Eagle, end quote. Now that I've gone over everything in part 1 and all of the other things I covered in this video, I wanted to talk about the topic that was the reason that sparked this entire deep dive. And that is Mike Jeffries and the alleged sex trafficking that happened during Mike's time as CEO at Abercrombie and with the models. Now, I always have written disclaimers at the beginning of my videos stating that this is all based on public information and alleged, but for this section of the video, I really have to reiterate that this is all alleged. I'm not trying to get sued here. I'm only going to be going by what has been posted online and what victims of this alleged sex trafficking stated. And you could form your own opinions based on the research I've done and, of course, on your own research. I know it's going to be very annoying to hear the words alleged or allegedly, but please know it's because I'm trying to cover myself here. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, let's get into it. On October 22nd, 2024, quote, a 16-count indictment was unsealed today in federal court in Central Islip, charging former Abercrombie Fitch Chief Executive Officer Michael Jeffries, along with Matthew Smith and James Jacobson, with sex trafficking and engaging in interstate prostitution. The indictment alleges that between December 2008 and March 2015, Jeffries, Smith, and Jacobson used a combination of force, fraud, and coercion to traffic men while operating a prostitution enterprise. All 3 defendants were arrested this morning. Jeffries and Smith are scheduled to make their initial appearances this afternoon in federal court in the Southern District of Florida, and Jacobson is scheduled to make his initial appearance this afternoon in federal court in St. Paul, Minnesota. They will be arraigned in the Eastern District of New York at a later date, end quote. But what were the details to this 16-count indictment? Well, about a year ago, the FBI opened an investigation after the BBC shared some claims that prior Abercrombie models had come forward with. These claims stated that Mike Jeffries and his partner Matthew Smith, along with a middleman named James Jacobson, sexually exploited and abused men at events they had in the New York residences and hotels all around the world. U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, Breon Peace, alleged that Mike Jeffries used his money, power, and status as a way to traffic men for his and his partner's Matthew Smith's pleasure. Breon Peace alleged that the couple hired James Jacobson as the recruiter for the men they wanted from across the world that they would pay for sex acts. Mike Jeffries would have to approve the men James found, and if they were what Mike wanted, they were flown to his home in New York. Once they made it to his home in New York, they were pressured to drink alcohol, take Viagra, and muscle relaxants. Prosecutors allege that Mike and Matthew had people or did this themselves, but that they would inject the victims they would perform sex acts with an erection-inducing substance. This was allegedly due to if the victims were unable to do it themselves or if they didn't want to participate. There were millions of dollars spent in order to keep this operation going and keep it going privately so that they wouldn't get in trouble, which, obviously didn't work out the way that they wanted to. However, this millions of dollars included international travel, hotels, and even paying people to work these events and be security for these events. This wasn't just these old men finding guys and forcing them to do sexual acts, but this was an entire operation. Prosecutors stated that there were 15 victims that were mentioned in the indictment, but that there were allegedly dozens and dozens of men. In October of 2024, Mike Jeffries was released on a $10 million bond, while James Jacobson was released on a $500,000 bond. Matthew Smith, Mike's partner, was ordered detained. Breon Peace had confirmed at a press conference that they originally found out about what was happening due to the media, specifically the BBC's investigation into Abercrombie's civil lawsuit that was accusing Mike Jeffries and Matthew Smith of sex trafficking, rape, and sexual assault. This just goes to show how much power the media has, and in this situation, it was used for good in order to bring justice to all the victims of this alleged sex trafficking operation. The lawsuit I just mentioned did accuse Abercrombie & Fitch of allegedly being what funded the sex trafficking operation throughout the 2 decades that Mike was CEO. Brad Edwards of Edwards Henderson is a civil lawyer representing some of the alleged victims, said, quote, "The unprecedented reporting of the BBC coupled with the lawsuit our firm filed detailing the operation are to credit for these monumental arrests. This was the result of impressive investigative journalism," end quote. I'll say it again, the media has a lot of power, and I'm happy to know that it might be the reason why some of these alleged victims will get justice. In the initial investigation that the BBC did, they spoke to 12 men who attended events that involved sex acts for Mike Jeffries and Matthew Smith between 2009 to 2015. 8 men who went to these events stated that they were recruited by James Jacobson. James Jacobson told BBC in a previous statement through his lawyer that he took offense at the suggestion of, quote, "any coercive, deceptive, or forceful behavior on my part and had no knowledge of any such conduct by others," end quote. The BBC interviewed many people, including some former household staff. Basically, they did their job as investigative journalists, and they did it well. When the BBC spoke with some of the men who were involved, they did say that they were misled, whether it was about the nature of the events or that there was sex involved, while others knew it would be sexual, but no specifics. However, all were paid. Some were even told that doing this raised their chances at future modeling at Abercrombie & Fitch. David Bradbury, who some of you who are reality TV show fans watching this might know him from Below Deck, but he was an aspiring model and did work for Abercrombie & Fitch. He was 23 when he met James Jacobson, and it was made clear to him that without giving James oral sex, he would not meet Mike Jeffries. David said that it was almost like Mike Jeffries was selling fame and compliance for the price you paid for it. David did claim that he eventually would meet Mike Jeffries and have sex with him, and this was because he didn't feel safe to say no. The BBC asked Abercrombie about all of this in its initial investigation, and they did say that they would open up their own independent investigations into these allegations, but when asked the status of this by the BBC, the company declined to answer. Of course, just like Mike and Matthew have been trying to get the civil lawsuit dismissed, so has Abercrombie & Fitch itself. The brand is arguing that they had no knowledge of the alleged sex trafficking. Well, I wonder if maybe there was some kind of evidence found, because earlier in 2024, the court ruled that Abercrombie has to cover the cost of Mike Jeffries' legal defense. The judge ruled that the allegations were tied to his corporate role after he sued the brand for refusing to pay his legal fees. Quote, "The brand said it did not comment on legal matters. However, in its defense submitted to court, Abercrombie said its current leadership team was previously unaware of the allegations until the BBC contacted it, adding the company abhors sexual abuse and condemns the alleged conduct by Mr. Jeffries and others. In 2014, Mr. Jeffries stepped down as CEO following declining sales and left with a retirement package valued at around $25 million. According to the company filings at the time. Once one of America's highest paid CEOs, he was a controversial figure who faced claims of discrimination against staff, concerns about his lavish expenses, and complaints about the unofficial influence of his life partner, Matthew Smith, inside Abercrombie & Fitch," end quote. I'm writing this script during the last few months of 2024, and this video will be posted most likely in the beginning of 2025, so some of the information in this video regarding this ongoing lawsuit might change. I might make an updated video with the outcome of the lawsuit, but if not, I might just make a pinned comment whenever everything is finalized and we know whatever is made public. As you might imagine, at one point Abercrombie made a bit of a comeback with the younger crowd. I actually started seeing the name Abercrombie popping back up on TikTok and Instagram. I will say I hadn't heard the name Abercrombie in a while, so I wasn't even sure if it still existed, as many companies have ceased to exist from my younger years. While I'm all for Abercrombie and Fitch trying to change their ways, and I do believe that people and companies can possibly change over time, but is this just performative for Abercrombie so that they can save the brand and keep going? This is obviously aside from all of what I just spoke about with Mike Jeffries. He hasn't been CEO since 2014, so that's 10 years, almost 15, of someone new and someone who isn't Mike Jeffries. There are a lot of companies who have been associated with incredibly horrible things and have come back from it, which Abercrombie can do, but as a millennial who grew up with Abercrombie, I still look at Abercrombie with a little bit of disgust knowing how problematic they were and just remembering the exclusivity of it all. Companies are still exclusive due to how much things cost and some people not having the budget for it, but if you lived it, you know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to Abercrombie. It's hard to put into words that make sense to people who weren't around during Abercrombie's peak. With all of that said, let's talk about the company's new direction, which is not the same as peak Abercrombie. It's still not affordable, at least in my opinion. Anyway, let's go over Abercrombie's rebrand because I think most of us can agree that it definitely needed one in order to survive. Fran Horowitz was appointed as the new CEO in 2017, and she really took Abercrombie to new heights. Now, I will say Abercrombie & Fitch isn't really my style, but I did see a few cute pieces, and the Abercrombie now is not the Abercrombie I used to know. According to one source, quote, "So many people are getting reacquainted with the brand that its stock quietly gained 285% last year, making it the best performing stock on the S&P index. It even beat out AI chipmaker Nvidia, and it's not like it's just a meme stock. Abercrombie has generated more than $4 billion in revenue in the last fiscal year," end quote. Clearly, the cool kids club or elitist way of marketing was not going to work for Abercrombie anymore. The times were completely different back then, and they were able to get away with a lot more. Instead of rebranding and marketing towards the younger crowd, they wanted to rebrand to their existing customers, which were millennials and Gen Z. I made a video about nostalgia marketing, which has definitely gotten me so many times. So for example, a millennial who wore Abercrombie in high school has some kind of nostalgic attachment to the brand, and a rebrand that in a way grew up with them is the perfect fit and a perfect marketing strategy. Quote, "For the next 5 years, Abercrombie & Fitch studied their main demographic. Now that the generations who encompass their main demographic are well into their professional careers, they could transform their clothing as more grown up. This meant designing clothes for brunches, destination weddings, and office wear. During their half a decade of research, they also concluded that women have many issues with jeans. Their design team began introducing blazers and suits for the office, dresses for weddings and parties, and stretchy curved love jeans, which are now half of all of their denim sales," end quote. And the whole women having a problem with jeans, I feel like this has been a very well-known thing for a long time. Any woman I've ever spoken to always complains about jeans, myself included, and finding the perfect fit. With this rebrand and with the ever-changing times, Abercrombie was smart to use influencer marketing to their advantage. All of this might sound like such a simple way to rebrand, but sometimes that's all you need, especially with a company such as Abercrombie & Fitch and their reputation from the early 2000s. Also, it might sound simple, but they had to come up with this plan and had to really study and listen to their customers and who they wanted to target. I wonder if Abercrombie & Fitch will be able to fully get away from their old image. It seems as though they are doing their best to change every aspect that Abercrombie had back in the day. The younger generations probably won't ever know about the old Abercrombie unless they watch a movie or something, but us older generations will always remember what Abercrombie used to be like. I'm curious to know whether or not Mike Jeffries and that whole case will affect the brand, but something tells me they might actually be safe. Unless if there is some kind of information that comes out that Abercrombie tried to cover something up, allegedly, again, not trying to get sued here, but they tried to allegedly cover up Mike's wrongdoings or whatever the case may be. That's really the only thing I could think of that would maybe actually hurt the brand. Anyway, let me know what your thoughts are. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you for watching this series and everything. I really, truly appreciate it. And this is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye.